I want to do a video today inspired by an interview done by physicist Richard Feynman. And basically, he talks about in his interview how if you ask simple questions about physics, like why do two magnets repel each other, it cannot be easily answered because each answer given relies on a subset of further whys which continue onward. For instance, if you were to ask why do magnets repel, it gets into magnetic forces and the orientation and composition of the atoms that make up the metal for the attraction and repelling of these magnets, which gets into further whys like, well, why is this metal made up of these substances? And it goes on and on and on. It's like that annoying kid who keeps asking you why. And then Feynman goes on to give the example of a woman who slips on ice. Forgive me if I said his name wrong. Feynman. And he goes on to say how if a woman slips on ice, the question could then be asked, well, why did she slip on the ice? And you will slowly start to see that a lot of things are taken for granted that shouldn't necessarily be taken for granted, or you just start to marvel at how many amazing things make up our universe on a day-to-day basis that we experience, that we have taken for granted, that make up the physics of our world. And for an alien species, something that's not familiar with our world, a species that has maybe a completely different construction of chemicals, elements, ways of living, communicating, it can all be very new and bizarre, which could easily be possible given the fact that there's billions of galaxies housing billions of star systems with dozens of planets on each one of those star systems so far discovered. There could be even more than that. And given the facts that there are a wide variety of different types of planets with different size suns and moons and all sorts of different characteristics and galaxy shapes and sizes and interactions with different galaxies creating different types of forces, there could definitely be a very bizarre planet out there that creates very different but yet similar in certain ways conditions to create life. But that's a topic for another video. The point being, such an alien species, something that's not familiar with our laws, would be very interested in all those components of the reasoning behind why this woman slipped on the ice. Well, okay, she slipped on the ice and broke her hip. Well, why did she slip on the ice in the first place? Well, she slipped on the ice because the pressure of the ice caused ice to melt very quickly at those pressure points, causing it to become a liquid and thus causing the friction to be less, which allowed her to slide and fall on the ice because she could not keep her balance. And then the aliens would continue asking questions on, well, what's the difference between solid and liquid? Why couldn't she keep her balance? Why does this pressure cause this? And then it goes on and on. What makes up the composition of these elements? Why do these elements exist in the way that they exist? And on and on and on. So I think it's quite interesting thing to just think about and ponder. And more so than that, I think it gets you wondering and just thinking about all the things that make up how amazing the world is. Let me just read you a response. This is a response by a anonymous user on a public community at reddit.com. And this was his explanation. It was one of the most upvoted explanations to a question set forth. The question was, why was magic so widely acknowledged in the old world if no one even saw it? How could they possibly believe this idea? And his explanation would just blow your mind in a certain way. It's somewhat long, but it's worth listening to. Here it goes. Let's go back to the Middle Ages. Not the Middle Ages shrouded by darkness or superstition. Just the Middle Ages in which we have not yet invented a number of very important but seemingly obvious philosophical ideas. So they knew that, for example, temperature affected the world around them. They could tell that temperature was real because it could make swords stick in hilts, or water freeze, or people die. But temperature wasn't really a thing you could hold or look at. It was this invisible force that's all around you, and you just sort of feel it. They knew that time passed, although realistically there's no proof of this concept. Time does not make candles go out. Fire does. Time does not make an hourglass settle. Gravity does. Not universal gravitation, the theory, the regular old things fall gravity. Time is just something that you felt past. Now that, okay, I'm going to pause real quick. That's where it gets kind of, wow. The fact that time itself wasn't something that was really a concept. The word time, there was probably ways of telling when you are from the time you woke up to the time you went to sleep. There's ways of judging where you are in the cycle. But the fact that the actual concept of time passing, and that being an actual concept of something we're moving through, I think that's pretty cool that they didn't really understand it. They knew that they aged and died, but they didn't understand the concept of time. Let's move on. So going on, they said they knew that people could get sick, and sickness made people do strange things, and it moved around between people. But sickness was not really a force you could observe. You could only see its effects in others, and you just feel it in yourself. They knew that people could be angry. Anger makes people do strange things. Anger tends to move around and spread among people, and it can't be touched or held, but you feel it. It's clearly different from illness, but how? I'm going to pause real quick again. I think it's very interesting. We have a lot of these things that we take for granted, and because of that, we look at these past people as these stupid individuals, but in reality, there's a lot of work put forth by experiments and scientists that have put forth the support and greater understanding of these concepts like emotions, anger. Now we know that anger is something that's a built-in reaction from our brain and our body, that's a natural, unconscious, immediate reaction that allows us to react quicker. And it's built in there because in old survival times we didn't have the time to think and ponder before reacting to certain quick events. Moving on, back on track with what he said. It gets more interesting here. Um, they knew magnets could attract metals. They knew that you could not see or touch the magnetism, but you can feel it and see its effects. Magnets do not attract mercury, so only some metals sometimes. They knew that it was always coldest when the sun was in Sagittarius and Capricorn. They couldn't see these constellations influence the Earth, but like clockwork, they did. When the sun is in Aries, the summer is near. They knew of tides, but no mechanism that ties the moon to the Earth without universal gravitation. They knew of hate, of faith, of virtue, and the ways these different things could make people act differently. They knew birds could fly, and so could insects, and so could balloons, and could burning paper, but not how. So why is it strange to believe that drinking a potion made out of the sweat of a man with a pot could give you a fever, but drinking one made from a man who murdered wouldn't make you angry? I'm going to pause real quick again. This gets into some pretty interesting stuff here, and it reminds me of I did a lot of studying on biology and disease, and it reminds me of how people back in the day, before experiments took place, and they really set forth the scientific method to logically prove or disprove things. They had all sorts of weird theories because you really didn't know at the time. You're just like, this man just completely starts vomiting, turning green, and he gets all these boils on his hands and feet. Like, how are we supposed to know what's causing this? So they made all sorts of there's all sorts of these weird theories around, like, well, it's because you committed adultery. Admit to your cheating, and sometimes they would, or you did this, or it's because you ate this fly, or you're near this mosquito, or some weird thing or other. They had the most bizarre things, and they come up with the most bizarre remedies as well that made no sense whatsoever, like putting leeches on you that suck up all your blood and all these weird stuff. And it kind of makes sense. Like, before scientifically proving or disproving something came about, where they set up experiments where they controlled it so that all other factors were made non-influential, and so it had to work in this way. Before that scientific method came about, they really had no idea. It could have been anything. They just knew that this stuff happened, and they're at a complete loss. The world was just this mystery. And I feel like another big thing is that everyone thinks that, like, we're so superior now, we're so technologically advanced, which is also completely bogus. Sure, we've come a long way, but we are kind of just, we've discovered a lot, but at the same time, we are still just as ignorant. Like, okay, back then, they didn't know that the earth was round, and they thought that the oceans ended and then you just fell into this abyss if you sailed far enough. Well, now it's kind of like the same thing with space. It's like, are you really that much better off? It's like, you don't know how far outer space stretches, what's really outside of it, and then all these physicists are getting into this weird mumbo jumbo stuff about how the earth is expanding and there is no end to it, and then there's nothing beyond that, and it's this weird physics stuff about time, space, and stuff like that. Those are their theories, and it's somewhat better because it's based on science, but still, it's like, there's so much stuff that we still don't know about the human body, about why certain things happen, dark matter, on and on and on. But we are better off having discovered what we have. And so, again, just a little anecdote. What they did to see, one thing that they didn't really know at the time was that They thought that illnesses were created by spontaneous creation. Like literally, it would just like maggots, for instance, and flies would spontaneously appear. And that was their theory. And then one man decided to do something very scientific, which was to logically prove this or disprove it. So he set up a situation where he set up this food, and at the time they thought that all this rotten food naturally, spontaneously combusted these maggots, which turn into flies. And he said, okay, almost always food turns rotten. Technically, always. Food turns rotten, and then lo and behold, there's maggots inside it, which turn into flies. I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to put this food into a special little container I made, which is glass, so we can see through it. But the tube's going to go up, and then it's going to go sideways, and then it's going to go down, and then it's going to be shaped in a strange way so that there's still air coming through and going out, but these maggots cannot get in it anymore. So my belief is that that there's no spontaneous creation. It's just that maggots come in and lay eggs. And so if my theory is true, then these maggots cannot get into it, and the food would not spoil and rot, and there would be no maggots inside of it. And then the experiment was run through numerous times, and you find that there are no maggots inside this food. The food still rotted because of the air, but no maggots. So you get the point. Back on track with this quote, however. So why is it strange to believe that drinking a potion made of the sweat of a man with the pox could give you a fever, but drinking one made from a man who murdered wouldn't make you angry? If rocks can make one another float in the air, he's talking about magnets, but it technically is kind of rocks. If lights can appear in the cold sky at night, he's talking about the moon and the stars. If a healthy, happy, wealthy, faithful man can collapse to the ground in an instant and die with no warning, he's talking about pretty much fevers or viruses and stuff like that. And that's kind of sad, honestly, because no doubt at that time and age there's men who did everything right. They were wealthy and so forth, and they were faithful to their wife, and then they got all sick, and then they're like, why is this happening? And then everyone would accuse him, you cheated on your wife, that's why it occurred. And then he knows deep down he didn't, and then he's like, yeah, I lost, and everyone's like, it means for sure you cheated. I mean, it's just a tragic situation for him to be in, and then he dies. But moving on, back to the quote. If a healthy, happy, wealthy, faithful man can collapse to the ground in an instant and die with no warning, how much further is magic from that? And I'm just going to pause one more time. I think this is a very interesting thing, because this really just makes me ponder about a point that I've mentioned before in a previous video, which is the fact that this is exceptionally interesting, the fact that so many things in our world are just taken for granted and just sort of accepted because science has somehow supported them and explained them logically to you, and then it's just like, okay, that kind of makes sense. But at the end of the day, does that not make it magical? The fact that we can flip a switch and lights appear above us, just because they are explained through science, does that not make it magical that we can now fly through the air on this giant clunk of specialized constructed metal with motors and cylinders and all sorts of things, and we can ride in these machines that can move at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour on the road, and we can record a certain time and space depiction of our existence for future generations and upload it onto a worldwide network connecting all these human beings for them to watch over and over again at their own leisure. I can go on and on, but I'm just going to stop there. You get the point. The point is that our world is magical beyond belief, but we have failed to accept it because we've grown up with it as a standard, much like the boy who is born into an inherited family of wealth does not find wealth that great because it's his standard growing up. I'm probably going to go on and on about it in another video strictly devoted to that, but you get the point. Moving on to this quote. Then pile on the fraud, the real but not understood chemical processes, such as why should lemon juice and finely powdered oyster shell begin to fizz when mixed, but lemon juice and finely powdered bone do not. The fact that news traveled slowly, the population was illiterate and could not research things for themselves. Again, it's interesting, you know, we got soda now that fizzes, we got all sorts of chemicals, and it's quite fascinating, and yet chemistry and science has sort of boiled it down. How did Pope Leo I turn back the Huns? Truth be told, we still believe in magic, just different magic. Just different things we think we know without knowing how. Have you seen a 4-year-old walk up to a TV that isn't on and try to touch the screen to wake it up? Have you seen a kid pick up literally any square object and try to talk to it?